father, with his wife, making sure the children are all right, and now he's taken on the Middle East, you know.
From 10 a.m. every Saturday, we want to make you think and we want to make you laugh.
So we will give you all the top stories.
Now we start with a story that has shocked the nation this week.
But we're also going to make it light and fun and bring some entertainment in to make your Saturday morning nice and restful.
Only on GB News, Britain's news channel.
Wake up to the headlines with Headliners every morning at 5 a.m. We treat you to the day's biggest stories before anyone else, 7 days a week. You can catch up on everything you need to know before you've even had your kippers. Headliners every morning at 5 a.m. only on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Good evening, lovely people. I am Neil Oliver and I was live the last time I looked. I'm on GB News TV and on the radio. My first guest this evening will be Canadian trucker and commentator Gord McGill, who joins me to talk about the case of 4 Canadian political prisoners in Canada, who became known as the Coots 4, jailed for more than 700 days without bail or process. I'll then be joined by Canadian journalist David Craden to discuss Trudeau's Online Harms Act. Sounds familiar? And finally, I'll be telling you about my new show, where I'll be splitting my time between an online 2-hour show on a Friday evening, as well as a new show which will be on your screens on Sunday evenings from 6 p.m. All exciting stuff. All of that in the company of my panellist, presenter and friend, the wonderful Andrew Eborn. But first, an update on the latest news from the one and only Tatiana Sanchez.
Neil, thank you very much, and good evening. Your top stories from the GB newsroom. Dozens of pro-Palestine marchers took to the streets across Britain today after Rishi Sunak called on organisations not to let extremists hijack protests. In a speech last night, he called for the nation to unite and said Islamist extremists and far-right groups are spreading poison. It followed George Galloway's controversial win in the Rochdale by-election this week, which the Prime Minister described as beyond alarming. The US military has carried out its first airdrop of aid into Gaza. It comes after the deaths of Palestinians queuing for food brought renewed attention to the growing humanitarian catastrophe. US President Joe Biden says he hopes to see a ceasefire agreement between Israel and Hamas before the start of Ramadan on the 10th of March. Germany is investigating after the apparent eavesdropping of a telephone call during which a potential weapons delivery for Ukraine was discussed. A recording of the call was broadcast by Russian media. Moscow says it shows German officials discussing the possible delivery of Taurus cruise missiles to Kyiv and a possible strike on a bridge in Crimea. Chancellor Olaf Scholz has publicly rejected requests for delivery of those missiles. He says the potential eavesdropping is very serious. However, officials maintain that its authenticity has not been verified. An MP who defected from the Scottish National Party to the Tory party says she faced terrible abuse. Dr Lisa Cameron switched parties in October last year after suffering what she described as toxic treatment by the SNP's Westminster group. She's accused her former party of turning a blind eye.
After years in the toxic SNP, it is just so refreshing for me to have a place in a party where we support each other and where we work together as a team. I knew that leaving SNP would mean I would become a target for the very, very worst of nationalism. But the bile and the vile threats that I have received were beyond even my wildest imagination.
Police are still investigating after 3 people were injured in a shooting in a part of London popular with bars and restaurants. 2 women were inside of a pub when they were hit by shotgun pellets after a suspect dropped a firearm during a police pursuit in Clapham. A 3rd person was injured by the moped itself. They've all now been released from hospital. Towns within commuting distance of major cities have seen some of the biggest rent rises in recent years. Newly published research by property website Zoopla shows that rents have risen by more than a third in some towns. Bolton, Newport and Bradford have seen sharp increases. They're all within short commuting distances from major cities. The company says that while city rents are rising fastest, affordability pressures are pushing more people further out. Now, a section of the famous sycamore gap tree is to return to public view as part of a display at a discovery centre. The much-loved 200-year-old tree was a popular attraction for visitors to Hadrian's Wall in Northumberland, but it was found cut down in mysterious circumstances last year, sparking a national outcry. Northumberland National Park says it received more than 2,000 heartfelt messages from all over the world. The largest section of the tree will now form part of a display at the Sill Discovery Centre near Newcastle, which is expected to be in place from September. Fashion icon Iris Apfel has died at her home in Florida at the age of 102. Known for her distinctive glasses and fun, no-nonsense approach to fashion, she founded the luxury company Old World Weavers with her husband in 1950. She went on to lead a long career in fashion. At the age of 97, she signed a major modelling contract with global agency IMG, just a year after a limited edition Barbie doll was created in her image. And the red carpet is out for the best of Britain's music industry ahead of tonight's Brit Awards, including the Princess of Pop.
Everybody's doing a brand new dance now. Come on, ready to the
Singing superstar Kylie Minogue will be crowned this year's global icon later, and she'll perform a medley of some of her greatest hits. Leading the main awards, however, is Ray, who's already broken records with 7 nominations, the most in a single year. Well, she's up against some stiff competition, with Dua Lipa and Olivia Dean also up for key awards. For the latest stories, you can sign up to GB News Alerts by scanning the QR code on your screen, or you can go to gbnews.com/alerts. Now it's back to Neil.
There's a memorable adage for times like these, that people should never fear their government. On the contrary, that the government should always fear the people. Damn straight they should. Those words are correct, because at their heart lies truth, truth never to be forgotten, that the only legitimate power is the power of we the people. Yesterday, Prime Minister Rishi Sunak made a speech outside Number 10. Unelected Prime Minister Sunak leads a government from within an establishment that has for years made possible and then turned a blind eye to the very anger and pain that is only now a problem he wants to bleat about. At the heart of it was a vote, a by-election, that didn't go the way of that establishment. In simple terms, if a Conservative candidate had been returned in Rochdale, it would have been business as usual. Frankly, it would also have been business as usual even if a Labour candidate had been handed a majority, or a Liberal, any establishment puppet. If any of those options had come to pass, courtesy of that same electorate, no one would have blinked. But something else happened instead, something not in the playbook. Veteran campaigner and thorn in the side of the establishment, George Galloway, was elected, and now the electorate responsible is labelled Islamist extremist. And he and they are firmly in the sights of that establishment and its big media. When is an extremist not an extremist? When he votes Conservative or Labour, that's when. Evidently, the government and by extension Parliament itself and the whole of the establishment is finally feeling the heat emanating from all sorts of angry people grown too numerous to ignore. Finally, the expression of that anger doesn't suit the agenda, and now the people are only bad people. I say too late and too bad. For this government, this Parliament, this establishment, too little and too late. The story of the popular anger has been years in the making, decades, a tragic story blithely ignored by one manifestation of a rotten establishment after another. That anger has roots in many places and is explained by many factors, but I see it all as symptoms of the same disease. In shorthand, this anger, this genie that won't go back in the bottle, is what a succession of governments get when they set in train and then facilitate the destruction of people's lives and sit back and do nothing to help, or indeed sit back to revel in their power over those people. Most recently, we've endured 4 years of the most dangerous and blatant assault on freedom and civil rights in the history of humankind. During what should go down in the history books as the era of the scamdemic, those occupying positions of power in government, in medicine, in big tech, in big media, inflicted on the people nothing less than sustained abuse on an unprecedented scale, abuse that all these years later is still unaddressed and unconfessed, utterly devoid of consequences for the guilty. Excess deaths, two little words hung like an albatross around their shoulders. Just days ago, the desperate had the temerity to change the way those deaths are assigned, the totals reached. Instead of facing up to the thousands of people that have died when they shouldn't have died, that are still dying unexpectedly and in ways unexplained every week since sometime in 2021, instead of so much as talking about those deaths, the rules of the game were changed instead to make those dead almost disappear. Almost. Those two little words, excess deaths, are nothing less than a straw to break a camel's back and part of the pressure pushing tectonic plates, moving the ground beneath politicians' feet, and they know it. And now, the anger of the people who endured all of that abuse is finally hot enough for the perpetrators to feel, loud enough for them to hear, unpredictable enough for them to fear. And true to form, true to the playbook, they must deflect and distract. Right-wing and Islamist extremism, oh yes, that'll do nicely. During the years of the COVID debacle, those politicians, doctors, scientists, big technocrats, big media were only confident and blasé. And so confident and blasé have they been until very recently, they've not even sought to deny the many ways in which they colluded on a global scale with measures and policies that destroyed millions of lives and that will destroy millions more. By the hand of those perpetrators, trust in the state was destroyed for millions for whom it will never return. Likewise, trust in science, trust in those physicians and other medical professionals who, through their oaths, first do no harm, onto the floor and trampled them while they made TikTok videos of their group dance routines. And now the people, too many people, for too many reasons and in too many places, are too angry to be ignored any longer. We have witnessed, indeed we continue to witness, the biggest transfer of wealth in history. We've suffered assault on privacy, assault on bodily autonomy, on freedom of speech, freedom to travel, to work. We suffered the insufferable authoritarians who revelled in their power and grew fat on the take. And whether those authoritarians knew it or not, the anger rose like floodwater. More of their evil nonsense in pursuit of the suicide of net zero finally provoked farmers to rise in protest, protests that spread all across Europe with the full-throated support of growing numbers of citizens. The anger's everywhere you look. Here, across Europe, the USA, even in Canada, once the most liberal of places, there is righteous fury in the aftermath of the crushing of the truckers' protest that saw another entitled, designer-suited puppet, Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, invoke the Emergency Act so that he might freeze protesters' bank accounts, throw them in jail. The USA has no functioning southern border, so that millions of unidentified migrants arrive day and night, changing, perhaps forever, the demographic and therefore the traditional voting patterns of state after state. There's talk of secession, even of another civil war. The UK has no border either, none that stops new arrivals by the tens of thousands every year, and people are angry and about more and more every day. I listened to Rishi Sunak's speech, unelected Rishi Sunak, and its background music of someone nearby howling some or other anger. His words, if they were his words and not the product of ChatGPT, ChatGPT, give me a 10-minute speech that makes me sound patriotic and like I'm the champion of democracy and the common people. Honestly, he said Britain is home to a democratic society with a proud past, a reasonable country and a decent people. He said we are a country of great achievements and enduring values and building Britain together. Talk about a brass neck. Where was this sort of rhetoric from Sunak or any other sock puppet when for decades spokesmen and women for communities up and down the country reported lives torn apart and for their troubles were labelled by the establishment as racists and fascists? Where was the talk of a proud past when statues were torn down, as schools and universities brainwashed generations with the certainty that here was a racist, colonialist, imperialist country? Where was the talk of building Britain together then? He said there were forces here at home, quote, trying to tear us apart, I don't know about you, but when I look back at the years just past, I see a government and the country's institutions aided and abetted at all times by a supine mainstream media seeking to do just that, to demonise all who challenged their diktats, like lockdowns, who questioned the safety of gene therapies pushed as vaccines, who challenged sabre-rattling for endless wars. Where was the government's support for peaceful protest when the mainstream media could think of nothing better than to call for so-called anti-vaxxers to be stripped of freedom, maybe have their kids taken from them, maybe be injected against their will? Millions of people here and all over the world, people simultaneously appalled by the events of October the 7th in Israel and by the deaths of tens of thousands of civilians in Gaza since, have marched in protest, calling for an end to it, for a ceasefire, but they are to be characterised to a man and to a woman as Islamist extremists, hate marchers. You can guarantee that the establishment's new robust framework to deal with protests will mean yet more shortening of the leash around our necks in this election year. Sunak talked about the necessity to abide by the rule of law. I look back at the past 4 years and wonder a great deal about rules. When law-abiding people were shut in their homes, lost their jobs if they wouldn't take doses of gene therapy, not to mention the madness of rule of 6, magic arrows on shop floors, masks when standing but not when sitting. I think of all the elderly who died in care homes, cut off from loved ones. I think about those who died in locked wards, ushered to the exit door of life by cocktails of midazolam and morphine, when a different course of action, an action predicated upon first doing no harm, might have had altogether different outcomes for thousands. Sunak said nearly everyone in Britain supports the basic values of rule of law. Rule of law, playing by the rules, playing the game. I think about behaviour like that and wonder if it's just the rule of law for us, and whether it's just blindingly obvious that rules only apply to us and not to those with the power to change the rules at will. Maybe Sunak's right, and most people in Britain do support those values of obeying the rules. But if you're asking me, the small and vocal hostile groups who do not, as he described them, is a neat description of the inhabitants of Westminster itself. He said extremists and the far right were equally desperate, two sides of the same coin, which was rich coming from one of the two cheeks of the same backside, presently sliding up and down the green benches of the Commons in the guise of the Conservative and Labour parties. Referring to Rochdale, he said, neither group accepts that change in our country can only come through peaceful democratic process. Does that mean a by-election that didn't work out for him, unelected as he is, already to be characterised as undemocratic? He said those extremists and right-wingers want to set Britain against Britain. He said extremists and their ilk aim to drain us of our confidence in ourselves and as a people. They want us to doubt ourselves, to doubt our country's history. Really, Rishi? I'd got the impression that was your job. Here's the thing. Politicians are properly rattled now after years of cynically frightening the people. What Sunak was up to yesterday was textbook gaslighting. Don't fear us hard-working MPs. Fear those neighbours of yours instead. He invoked, too, the wrong side of history, which is a reckless, some might say desperate move by a puppet up to his strings in the wrong side of history. I agreed on one line he had, that our Britain must not be a country in which we descend into polarised camps, but he and his ilk have long since surrendered the right to say as much. The same people who cheerfully and ruthlessly exploited propaganda to drive a divisive rhetoric when it got them what they wanted, now want everyone to pull together as one, as a shield to protect them from the consequences of their actions. As the adage would have it, Parliament is afraid of the people once more, all of the people. This is a good thing. I am joined now by lawyer, futurist, broadcaster, all-round smarty pants, friend of the show, Andrew Eborn. Andrew, an unelected Prime Minister makes a speech decrying a candidate who got in by a majority vote, calling that a threat to democracy. Is that an unedifying spectacle?
It's crazy. First of all, I have to say, it's probably one of the best speeches that Rishi's made. And a lot of people have sort of said this is what sort of happened. It's interesting, as soon as you get the podium out there, you all assume he's going to call an election, which obviously didn't happen. But a number of points on it. Firstly, you can't say it's undemocratic when a democracy voted in a candidate. You can't label somebody as extremist just because they got an alternative view to you. We have to have an environment where we question everything. And as soon as you stifle debate, that's when you start having problems, because we need to make informed decisions. We're surrounded in a diseased information world where a lot of the information that we're getting is false. Everybody's suddenly become an expert, whether it's a virologist or it's going to be somebody about constitution and so on and so forth. And that's what we need to do, is find the experts, get those legitimate questions answered, because without that, there's not a proper debate.
I called his behaviour yesterday gaslighting. Do you think that's justified? Because, as I saw it, all sorts of problems are out there in the world and in this country. And yet again, a Prime Minister, a politician, their first move is to blame the people.
Yeah.
Some of the people, divide the people, set one group against another.
And it's very difficult, as I say, because you can't shut down debate. And I think come together doesn't mean you have to have the same opinion. A healthy democracy depends on a healthy debate and informed decisions. And as soon as you shut down that debate, that's when the problems arise. But I think there's some legitimate points. I mean, politicians now are so scared that some of them are... people have already been murdered, some people are not standing again because they fear for their life. That is wrong. So when you're talking about the side of law, you have to absolutely abide within the law. It's a freedom of speech, but it's not freedom from consequences. But there is a difference between that and a legitimate debate.
But that, well, let's call it recklessness, for years, where the contents of Westminster felt able and justified in taking away one freedom after another, in one way or another destroying or ending uncounted numbers of lives. What on earth possessed them to think that they could operate in that way with impunity, without eventually, one way or another, ending up facing angry people?
Yeah. Well, again, you've got to ask, well, why would they do it? And they will always say, in their defence, they're trying to follow the science, that it's not their fault, this is what the scientists told them to do, because that's the safest thing. You have to lock people up to prevent the spread of COVID and so on and so forth.
We know now that was all nonsense. So that was all nonsense. They were pushing nonsense, and they knew they were pushing nonsense. And furthermore, they were pushing gene therapies as vaccines when there was no safety evidence relating to those products.
So the real question, as I say, question everything. We must be entitled to question everything. Why would they do that?
Well, why would they do that? I mean, I would say the whole thing was always predicated upon control, predicated upon power, shortening the leash, in fact, setting in train a sequence of events that had possibly been in the pipeline for decades. And whatever it was, whether it was Brexit, whether it was Trump, whether it was something else, a decision was taken to pull the trigger and get everyone back in their box. And now that box has exploded on them.
Yeah, it's interesting because politicians are in the business of getting re-elected. So it's very short term for a lot of things. You have to have these policies to make sure you're re-elected in the next 4 years, but you still need to address those fundamental issues. And I think you're right, we should continue questioning everything, shine more light and less heat on these issues and get those answers.
Question everything. It's a break already, after which I'll be joined by a Canadian trucker, Gordon McGill, to talk about why 4 peace protesters who took part in the truckers' convoy were arrested, refused bail and left to languish in jail for more than 700 days. Don't go away.
Big news, big debates, big opinion. Patrick Christie's Tonight is the week's biggest show. Every weekday, 9 to 11 p.m, we've got the inside track on the day's top stories. There'll be sharp takes you won't get anywhere else. We will set the news agenda, not just follow it, and I want to bring you along for the ride. Whatever it is, we'll have our finger on the pulse. It's news, but it's this close to entertainment. Patrick Christie's Tonight, 9 to 11 p.m, only on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Farage, Monday to Thursday from 7 p.m.
We're always told that there is a huge need for care workers in Britain. We're always told that the salaries just aren't big enough against the benefit system for British people to want to do that work. And there probably is some real truth in that. And yet, if up to 25% of those that come are acting illegally, and it would seem up until now that in some areas, foreign care workers come in, but bring in almost the same number of family members with them, that we need to have a proper debate about this. I'm very pleased to be joined by Mike Padgham, chair of the Independent Care Group. If I accept those arguments for a moment, how can it be that the system is so lax that up to 25% are found by the Inspector of Borders and Immigration to be working illegally?
Well, good evening to you, Nigel. It was good to join you. I mean, those figures are shocking to me. When I looked at it today, when I saw that 275 visas had been issued to a care home that didn't even exist, and a further over 1,000 people joined a company that only had previously 4 staff in it, it makes me wonder the bureaucracy of the Home Office didn't think to check that these companies exist in the first place, because it should be quite straightforward. If people are providing care, they're regulated by the Care Quality Commission. It's a simple phone call to check and double check. Sadly, there seems to have been very many loopholes at the beginning. I believe that's been tightened now, but I can't understand it, because all the providers that are doing it in the proper way have to go through quite a rigmarole to actually get approved, and it takes months. So it beggars belief that this has happened and people have been approved for a company that doesn't even exist.
I'm Michelle Dewberry, and I'm not here to tell you what to think. I'd much rather hear what you have to say. So send in your opinions to gbviews@gbnews.com. Keep them clean, and you never know, I might read them out. With my panel here on Jubes & Co, we debate, we get stuck into the issues of the day on a show where all views are welcome, especially yours. GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Welcome back to Neil Oliver Live. Now, 4 truckers who took part in the freedom process in Canada in February 2022 were arrested then and held in prison for more than 700 days on conspiracy to commit murder, amongst other things. More than 2 years later, 2 of them are still awaiting trial in prison in Alberta. I'm joined now to talk about this by fellow trucker and political commentator nowadays, Gord McGill. Hi, Gord, how are you doing?
I'm well, Mr. Oliver. Thanks for having me. As a fellow Scotsman, it's good to hear your accent again. My mother's from Airdrie.
Oh, really? No, gosh, my goodness. OK. Well, please call me Neil. God, if I can start. Canada and political prisoners. It sounds utterly bizarre that the Canada that I grew up thinking of as the home of freedom would be holding some of its own citizens as political prisoners. Can it be true?
Well, unfortunately, it is true, and there are other actions of the government that prove it. Many people who took part in the Freedom Convoy protests, just regular participants who are expressing their democratic rights to protest in the streets of Ottawa or at Coutts or at any number of other locations, are still fighting what some people call lawfare, where the government is still litigating against them, still throwing charges at them, either delaying disclosure of evidence. And in the cases of some people who were acquitted of charges they received for participating in the protests in the wake of the Emergencies Act invocation, are now having those acquittals appealed by the Crown. So they're being brought back into expensive litigation in the courts just because Trudeau can't be shown to have been wrong.
We're looking at pictures now, who are these men? From what backgrounds do they come? What was their history? That they were accused of plotting to kill.
Right, the Coutts 4 men, as they've become to known, are just 4 regular working class guys. You know, Jerry Morin was a power lineman. Chris Lyzak's an electrician. Tony Oleanick was a trucker and owned a gravel quarry. Chris Carbert had a sort of, a maintenance business. So they're just 4 regular working class guys who had suffered under the COVID regime as so many other millions of Canadians and so many other people throughout the rest of the world. And they came to Coutts, this town on the border between America and Canada, to protest and take part in their democratic rights. And it seems to me, once you investigate the evidence, that they have been used as sacrifices to legitimate Trudeau's invocation of the Emergencies Act, as there was no violence to be found at any of the protest sites. And it looks like the RCMP and the Crown concocted a fantasy that these guys were going to murder police officers, and two of them have been in jail ever since. Two of the gentlemen were let out a few weeks ago with all of the charges against them dropped on plea deals where they signed off on minor gun charges that were not part of the original suite of charges they faced, which brings the entire artifice into question. And if you're paying attention, like, what does this say about your right to protest, your right to freedom of speech, if the government can pick you up at a totally peaceful protest, concoct a fantasy against you, put you in jail for 2 years, deny you bail, not even get the trial underway, and then at the end of it all just say, oh, well, sorry about that, we're going to drop the charges now. Like, what right to protest do you actually have?
Now, you mentioned the Emergency Act, which was so controversially brought down by Trudeau's government. I'm right in saying, am I not, that a federal court has since described the invocation of that act in those circumstances as illegal anyway?
Correct. A federal judge ruled that Justin Trudeau had in fact illegally taken away the rights, the charter-protected rights of a couple of people who launched challenges against it, and did in fact rule that it was illegal. And what do you know? Like, I think it only took 17 minutes for Trudeau's deputy, Chrystia Freeland, and some of his other underlings to launch an appeal. Like, they didn't even have the time to read the nearly 200 pages of that ruling. They just appealed it immediately without even considering the fact that they may have been wrong.
Andrew Eborn, you're a lawyer. You're listening to that. How does that sequence of events
Well, it's abhorrent that people can have their liberty taken away without any substantial evidence against them. The whole idea of the rule of law is that you should protect everybody, and it's about that sort of side. When you hear about these sort of cases, 700 days taken away from their family, put in solitary confinement, denied all sorts of human rights as a result of it, that's abhorrent, and it must never happen again. We've had very recently a number of examples, like here in the post office, same sort of thing, people taken away, wrongly charged, having to basically plea deal, if you like, in order to get reduced sentences or whatever. Now, that is wrong, and it shouldn't be happening anywhere in the world.
Gord McGill, is there any sign of consequences? You know, there's the government, the Canadian government, found to have acted illegally in bringing down the Emergency Act in the way that it did. People accused of egregious crimes without any evidence brought forward so far, two of whom have been released with all charges dropped. There's a mounting list. You know, the bona fide Nazi veteran given a standing ovation in the Canadian Parliament. Is any of that rap sheet looking like having any sort of consequences for the people responsible?
No, and they call our Prime Minister Teflon Trudeau for a reason. You know, he's the darling of the Laurentian elite who really run the country. And Trudeau has done an amazing job at insulating himself from any legitimate or substantial critique in the media. We have to remember that the mainstream media in Canada, including the private broadcasters, not just the CBC, were given a $600 million subsidy in 2019 and have received a number of top-ups and extra money through various programs. And Trudeau has bought himself, specifically with this case with the men from Coots, a code of silence. The media will not talk about it. They claim to hide behind a publication ban, which the defense brought, but that publication ban was only on a narrow set of information involving the information to obtain for the warrants. But the government and the media could be asking these questions of the government. How come we have political prisoners in Canada? Why were two of these men kept in solitary confinement? Why were they denied bail when none of them had criminal records and they're totally upstanding citizens? Why have they been kept in jail and this trial hasn't got underway for 2 years? All of these questions are legitimate, and there's nothing stopping them from asking them except that they don't want to bite the hand that feeds them. Trudeau has bought the media, and we live in, it's just incredible how much they accuse us of peddling in misinformation and disinformation. They are guilty of lying to the Canadian people by failing to report on this case.
Andrew, this failure by mainstream media to hold to the fire the feet of those responsible for what certainly seemed to be egregious acts is awfully familiar.
Yeah, and it is worrying if we're going to be in that sort of say, what's great about this programme is you do call things out. You do say, let's question it. It doesn't mean we've got the answers, but we have to, when you hear about these abhorrent cases and working on that sort of basis, there has to be somebody who's going to fight for the underdog. And the fact that we've had a number of cases similar to this, where basically they don't happen until you make it an ITV drama or something like that, that's nonsense. The mainstream media, we're here to always hold people's feet to the fire.
Gord McGill, trucker, more recently commentator and citizen journalist, thanks for joining me tonight. Keep up the good work and perhaps we'll catch up again in the near future. Thank you very much. Another break, after which Canadian journalist David Craden will join me to discuss new proposed online controls for Canada, which he calls a new standalone hate crime offence on the way. Don't go anywhere.
2024, a battleground year.
The year the nation decides.
As the parties gear up their campaigns for the next general election.
Who will be left standing when the British people make one of the biggest decisions of their lives?
Who will rise?
And who will fall? Let's find out together.
For every moment, the highs, the lows, the twists and turns.
We'll be with you for every step of this journey.
In 2024, GB News is Britain's election channel.
Headliners. Tomorrow's papers tonight. Every night from 11 p.m.
Is a debate on gender really a far-right issue?
Far right. I'm so bored of that phrase, you know what I mean? Like, anyone who talks about, anyone who acknowledges that there are two sexes is suddenly far right, because that's what Hitler and Mussolini were all about. This question from Shirley is, of course, about Labour. They've been accused of being undemocratic because they pressured a pub into cancelling a debate, and this debate features Kelly J. Keane, who's been on this show a couple of times, and she's a campaigner, and she was just on the panel, and then they got a letter saying that they couldn't do it because Kelly J. Keane apparently attracts far-right groups. Now, they've tried this trick before, but because some awful, ghastly neo-Nazi types turned up near to an event that she was holding in Australia, they kind of tried to blame that on her and suggest that the two were the same thing. They weren't. That was an opportunistic group turning up to... They're not... Neo-Nazis aren't pro-feminist. They're not pro an event called Let Women Speak. That's just ridiculous.
New Zealand's TV blurred her touching her zip because they said that her touching her zip was a far-right dog whistle because she's making that symbol.
Yeah, but she wasn't making the symbol, she was just adjusting a zip.
Yeah,
and
also, this isn't a far-right symbol.
I mean, that was incredible because she obviously wasn't making that symbol anyway. She was just adjusting a top. But this New Zealand news channel blurred out the hand so that they could pretend that it was some horrible ghastly... Yeah. I mean, this is learning stuff, isn't it?
She's talked about having voted Labour in the past. She's so not far right.
But also,
I mean,
even if she were right-wing, which she isn't, why would they be banning a panel where there's a discussion about one of the most important issues of our day? What are Labour playing at here?
They're anti-democratic, aren't they? They're just kind of playing whack-a-mole with things they don't like. I think maybe I'll write to the pub and say I do want to see Kelly J. Keane there.
Yeah, but they won't listen to you
well,
if you
no,
say that, will they?
Because
you've got the unfashionable opinion, Chris.
Well, and the unfashionable workplace.
I'm Christopher Hope.
And I'm Gloria DiPiero, bringing you
PMQ's Live here on GB News. Every Wednesday, we'll bring you live coverage of Prime Minister's questions when Rishi Sunak and Sir Keir Starmer go head-to-head in the House of Commons.
We'll be asking our viewers and listeners to submit the questions that they would like to put to the Prime Minister, and we'll put that to our panel of top politicians in our Westminster studio.
That's PMQ's Live here on GB News, Britain's election channel.
Welcome back. Thanks for staying. My next guest this evening is Canadian journalist David Craden, who joins me, and not for the first time, to talk about the new Online Harms Act being introduced in Canada. Billed as a way to address dangers that children face online, the Act also includes the introduction of stiffer penalties for so-called hate offences, stirring up hate, The bill proposes increasing the maximum punishment for advocating genocide to life imprisonment and allowing sentences of up to 5 years in prison for other hate propaganda offences. David, are you there?
I am, and I'm wearing my Think While It's Still Legal T-shirt. I usually have a tie on when I'm on your show, Neil. But this is so important to get this across to an international audience. What's happening in Canada? We are on the verge of losing freedom of speech with this Online Harms Act. I was expecting this thing to be called the Online Safety Act, like it has been called in the UK and Australia. But I think I registered my opprobrium too effectively because they changed the name of it, and they've moved from calling out misinformation and disinformation, and now they're focusing on hate speech and even something called harm content, which I'm not quite sure what that means. But this bill, as you mentioned at the beginning, can get you life imprisonment for violating what they're calling a harm online offense. And it can get you a $70,000 fine from one of these human rights tribunals, which are going to be recharged after Stephen Harper, the former prime minister, got them out of the hate speech business. So they're going to be up doing their Spanish Inquisition again, and people will be filing complaints from stand-up comics to people on YouTube who are in any way offending them, or if it can be at all purported that they're somehow promoting these three things: hatred, violent extremism, terrorism, or violence itself. And by that definition, Neil, I would be promoting violent extremism by saying anything positive about the Freedom Convoy, because that's how Justin Trudeau described the Freedom Convoy: as misogynist, racist, Nazis, and violent extremists. Although, of course, we all know they engaged in absolutely no violence. But that's what we're up against now. This is frightening. This is a complete betrayal of 500 years of English-speaking democracy from the Magna Carta on. This is a violation of everything Canada has always been about.
David, bear with me. Andrew, this sounds very obviously, it reminds us of the online safety bill in the UK that so many of us have been and continue to be alarmed about. Where are we going? Why are one government after another in supposedly liberal societies seeking to shut down anyone who says anything they don't like the sound of?
Yes, and you're absolutely right. We need to look at that freedom of speech aspects. And it is interesting talking about the change in language, whether it's, the online safety bill as opposed to the Online Harms Act that they're talking about in Canada. But a lot of things they're trying to guard against, and they've got the list of 7 which they talk about here, which you would obviously want to stop. And the one sort of things, basically anything that induces a child to harm themselves, so that sort of stuff, videos on that sort of thing, content that foments hatred. If you're looking at that sort of thing, the question is, where do you draw the line? Because you have to have a society where we can discuss things at the same time, which I like the T-shirt that he's wearing, because you're right, it's make it illegal to think, and then we've got a really big problem in society.
David, you're a journalist, you're working in Canada, but what's happening in terms of other protests in your country? Is this being protested in Parliament? Is it being protested in the mainstream media in Canada?
There has been limited pushback from the legacy media in Canada. I'm not seeing hurrah, hurrah, we're doing something good with this bill. The Conservative opposition in the House of Commons is not taking this bill sufficiently seriously. And they have complained that it's simply, all we have to do is prosecute these evil people out there who are exploiting children. But of course, that's not what this bill is about. That's the veneer. That is how Trudeau is justifying it. And Poilievre has complained about the fact that there's this new Digital Safety Commission of Canada. And he's right about that. We've created another arm of bureaucracy. And I don't know if this is going to be a department within a department or an agency, but this is going to be effectively an online censorship bureaucracy in Canada that is going to be responsible for deciding what is hate speech and what is not. And I've always said, if you want to call Karl Marx hate speech, I think you could argue that point. But I don't want to start banning people I disagree with simply because I think they might say something that can be construed by somebody somewhere as hateful. This whole hate speech law should be anathema to democratic values, to freedom of speech.
And when you say that, when you say that, David, an anathema, from where is this attitude coming? In peaceful, peace-loving, supposedly liberal democratic societies like Canada, like New Zealand, like Australia, like the UK, what is underlying this drive now to shut down debate and freedom of speech, which is absolutely at the core of democracy as we've been trained for centuries to understand it? What's driving this?
I think it's clearly this globalist agenda that is being driven by globalist elites who want to destroy those democratic countries, who want to see democracies like the UK, like Canada, like Australia, like New Zealand, and America die. They do not want these countries to continue to exist as bastions of freedom, because that's not what their agenda is about. It's about enslavement. It's about taking over these countries. And Trudeau is simply preaching and introducing this globalist agenda in the same way as we're seeing it in the European Parliament, as we've seen it in your country, and we see it in the United States as well. That's what is going on here. This is a diabolical law. I don't use that term loosely. This is a very sinister attempt to control how people think and how they speak. And there's even thought crime in this bill, believe it or not, because you can be arrested for merely being suspected of perhaps saying something hateful, perhaps being guilty of harmful speech. And somebody literally can call me out for saying, I think Creighton might say something hateful in the future, so we should take him off the air. I mean, that is something right out of Nazi Germany and Soviet Russia, where people used to say, the only time I felt like I could speak my mind or I could speak truth was at midnight lying in bed, because that's when I thought nobody was really listening. And that is what is so horrible about this, is it is going to force people to self-censorship.
Yeah. Andrew Eborn, again, I see you're a lawyer.
Yes.
I've always understood that when it comes to laws that affect the lives of millions of people, it has to be tied down very, very precisely. But it feels that there's this inherent ambiguity in these new legislative offerings, such that they're just open to interpretation. And should that be the case, that laws that could put people behind bars for life are just the subject of context and interpretation?
You're absolutely right. We touched on this earlier. It's the biggest problem is the label. If you look at the extreme cases, you don't want to have content encouraging people to be violent. You don't want content encouraging people for terrorism or to self-harm. All of those things are abhorrent. The difficulty is when you apply a label, in the same way as we talked about earlier, you say someone's an extremist if they have an opposite view. And that's the real difficulty. It's about that interpretation. As a lawyer, you want to have a precise definition so that you do know that our right to freedom of speech is not going to be affected.
David Creighton, just a last word from you while I still have you. Are the people of Canada, we get away from the media, get away from the politicians, are the people of Canada aware, in the way that you would like them to be aware, of the implications of this legislation?
I hope they are. It's very difficult to gauge that. There has been a tremendous amount of discussion about this bill since Monday afternoon when it was introduced on social media. There seems to be a general consensus among most journalists that this is a destructive bill, and this is not really about protecting children or making things safer for children. It's about destroying free speech. So yes, I think Canadians will rally. My concern is this bill will pass before the next election. And once bills pass, they're difficult to repeal. They tend to become vested interests.
Indeed they are. David Creighton, journalist, commentator, thank you so much for this evening. We'll speak again. another break, a final break, after which I'll be telling you all about my new show, just chewing the fat about it with Andrew Eborn here. It's all change. I'll be going online and I'll also be on your TV screen, but on another time. So much to tell you about. Don't go anywhere.
From 10 a.m. every Saturday, we want to make you think and we want to make you laugh.
So we will give you all the top stories.
Now we start with a story that has shocked the nation this week.
But we're also going to make it light and fun and bring some entertainment in to make your Saturday morning nice and restful.
Only on GB News, Britain's news channel.
I'm Andrew Doyle. Join me at 7 o'clock every Sunday night for Free Speech Nation, the show where I tackle the week's biggest stories in politics and current affairs with the help of my 2 comedian panellists and a variety of special guests.
Free Speech Nation, Sunday nights from 7 on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Headliners. Tomorrow's papers tonight, every night from 11 p.m.
Welcome back to Headliners, and Paul, we're going to get straight into Monday's mail for some good old-fashioned, traditional male breastfeeding.
Yeah. To answer the question, what is the latest woke hell, Josh? Row as hospitals say hormone-filled milk from trans women who were born male is just as good for a baby as the real thing. It's possible for men, if they pump themselves full of estrogen, to grow larger breast tissue, and they often do.
Or you just eat lots of burgers.
Exhibit A. And once you've done that, it is actually then possible to express or lactate a liquid. Okay. If to that liquid you then add another load of pills, medication, chemicals, whatever, that lactation juice can be fed to a baby.
We don't really... This is not for the sake of the baby. The baby has no benefits from this whatsoever. The studies are very weak on it. It's a bit worrying because, you know, when hospitals started indulging in homeopathy and having, the NHS had homeopathic hospitals, that was worrying because they're supposed to be a trusted authority. And before saying something like this, there should be an awful lot of study done.
I want to shame this hospital. This is
whether it's necessary.
University Hospital Sussex NHS Foundation Trust. That's who it is. And they have written one of the stupidest sentences I have read aloud in the 2 years that I've been privileged to do this show. It says, the term human milk is meant to be neutral and not gender biased.
Yep.
Wow.
Yep.
That's incredible.
Yep.
Oh, my God, we're laughing at you.
I mean, and as someone says here, babies are not props. And that's the scary thing. And when we're not focusing primarily on the health of a baby.
No, but the feeling of a person doing it rather than... It's a bit of an odd way to go, isn't it? So...
Every Sunday from 11, join Michael Portillo.
There will be topical discussion, looking at the week before and the week to come. So kick back and relax at 11 a.m. on Sundays on GB News with me, Michael Portillo. GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
On Mark Dolan tonight, Prince Harry has lost his case against the Home Office for royal protection when he's in the UK. I'll be giving my verdict on whether the prodigal prince should have the same security as a serving royal. Plus, is antidepressant medication a scam? I'll be asking a top expert who says popping the pills isn't always the answer. Plus, my pundits, Mark Meets, and tomorrow's papers. We're live at 9.
Welcome back to Neil Oliver Live. Now, some might say it's self-indulgent, but I kind of have the feeling that it might be a good idea to tell you in advance about changes to this show. There's always a lot of interest, a lot of feedback. I see a lot of comments on social media and all of the rest of it. And I thought in advance of the changes, rather than them just suddenly appear as though through a trapdoor, we could talk it through. And Andrew's a regular contributor to this show, so I thought I could, canvass a little bit of opinion right up front. But the changes are going to come in next week. I will be appearing I'll be hosting a 2-hour show, which will go out, first of all, on a Friday online. Okay, so it will go out by, on the various apps and on YouTube and all of the rest of it, by whatever means anyone accesses that kind of content. So that'll be 2 hours. And then on a Sunday, on the following Sunday, at 6 o'clock, which is the usual time but a different day, a 1 hour version of that show will be broadcast in the usual way. Now, for me, I'm very excited about having 2 hours again. Those with long memories might remember that I had 2 hours in the beginning and it became 1 hour. I'm very much looking forward to the opportunity to give conversations the chance to breathe, to get properly into the topic, to let people relax into a conversation. So with that as a prospect, Andrew, what do you make of the all-new Neil Oliver show?
Well, it's something that we've spoken about. Every time we finish a programme, we've always said, I've had the joy of being with every possible iteration, whether it's down in the Westminster studio or here, we've always said, oh, I wish we had more time with this guest, because it was about to get really interesting and unpack it more. So I'm delighted that you've got 2 hours. It's also the way a lot of media is going. You need to be more platforms than Paddington, as I always say. You turn around on that sort of basis. So to get a full 2 hours of you and basically unpacking stuff, it also helps around the world, because you get different timings and so on and so forth. You've got America waking up at different times, Australia and so on and so forth. And you've got an amazing global audience. The figures you're doing on these social media platforms are just tremendous.
Yeah, and I mean, there is, it's the idea of GB News America.
Yes.
You know, there is an offering that is being shaped and offered to that, you know, audience of hundreds of millions
and that's the thing, yes,
States of America. And as you say, I very much look forward to the possibility of it being determinedly pushed out to a global audience as well as to the cherished viewership here in the UK.
And it is incredible. I see the feedback to the show and the brilliant comments that people come in. And it's all over the world. So they're watching at the moment on YouTube and various other platforms, not necessarily in a linear way. So you need that sort of basis. You need to make sure that you bring Neil Oliver to the world and your voice gets heard. But also you've then got the reason to unpack. And we always say, look, people are running out of time. And how many shows have you and I sat through and said, oh, we should have had more time with this guest. It was just getting interesting.
Speaking of which, we're running out of time. That's all for this week. Big thank you to all my guests. Thanks as always to Andrew E. Bourne. Anytime now, stay with us. It'll be the Saturday 5, and I will see you in a new way next week.
Looks like things are heating up. Boxed boilers, sponsors of weather on GB News.
Hello there, I'm Greg Dewhurst and welcome to your latest GB News weather. It's going to be quite chilly tonight, some frost and fog and some icy stretches around, but Sunday should be drier and brighter. We currently have low pressure in charge of our weather, but it does start to move away through Sunday, allowing a drier day before then further wet and windy weather spreads in from the west for Monday. For this evening time, we do have outbreaks of showery rain, sleet and some hill snow across northern England, spreading into Scotland, parts of Northern Ireland and some western fringes of Wales too. Elsewhere, we'll see some clear spells, and as temperatures drop overnight, we'll see some mist and fog patches forming, some icy stretches too. Temperatures in the countryside -2 to -5 Celsius. So could be some tricky travelling conditions across central southern parts of England first thing, dense fog patches, but they slowly lift and break. And then for most, it's a bright and cheery day, plenty of sunny spells, a scattering of showers across western parts of the UK, and this weather front close to the east could give some patchy rain along the east coast. Temperatures up a little bit compared to Saturday, a bit more brightness around. It will just feel a little less cold. Then into Monday, this weather system starts to move into western areas, bringing some outbreaks of heavy rain and brisk winds too. Elsewhere, a cold, frosty start, but then plenty of sunshine across the north and east through the day, and temperatures a little higher once more. It remains mixed Tuesday and towards the middle of the week, but temperatures a little above average. See you soon.
A brighter outlook with Box Solar, sponsors of weather on GB News.
Wake up to the headlines with Headliners every morning at 5 a.m. We treat you to the day's biggest stories before anyone else, 7 days a week. You can catch up on everything you need to know before you've even had your kippers. Headliners every morning at 5 a.m. only on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
I'm Jacob Rees-Mogg and this is GB News, Britain's news channel.
Sir Jacob Rees-Mogg's State of the Nation, Monday to Thursday from 8 p.m.
You're now in exile. I imagine it wouldn't be safe for you to go back to Russia. Can I ask you if you feel safe personally, and what do you think can be done to remove Putin, or is he going to be there for as long as he wants?
I think that is, of course, fundamental question. It is there should be pressure inside Russia and outside. Inside Russia right now, it's impossible because Putin put all leaders in jail and some of us just abroad. You know, just two were already killed. Mr.